If you believe family is always the place where you will be loved, my story will make you think again. My name is Claire Hamilton. I am 32 years old now, and I sit at the helm of Hamilton Hotels, a luxury chain stretching from Boston to London. But the shine of success hides a truth few people know. To get here, I had to climb out of the shadows of rejection, humiliation, and silence that came from the very people who should have protected me. When I close my eyes, I can still see that house in Brookline. A classic colonial white columns standing like soldiers at the entrance shutters. Painted hunter green, the lawn trimmed so perfectly it looked like velvet. Neighbors admired the Hamiltons and whispered about our picture-perfect life. My father, Richard, was a powerful attorney whose name appeared regularly in Boston's legal journals. My mother, Margaret, was the social butterfly always on the board of some charity, always smiling at the right faces. And then there was Andrew, my older brother, their pride and joy. He was the Hamilton heir, the golden son. And then there was me, Claire, the second child, a daughter, a shadow. Andrew had been groomed for greatness since he could walk. At 7, he wore miniature suits to Sunday dinners. At 10, he could recite legal terminology as if it were nursery rhymes. At 15, he was already winning debate championships and was praised as the future of our family legacy. Meanwhile, I was quietly falling in love with something else. Whenever we stayed in hotels during family vacations, I found myself mesmerized by lobbies, fascinated by the staff who moved in sync to make everything appear effortless. I would collect brochures, examine room keys like treasures, and imagine myself one day creating places where strangers could feel cared for. But in the Hamilton household, that fascination was considered a flaw. I remember one dinner when I was 12. The long oak table glowed under the chandelier crystal glasses sparkling with the reflection of golden light. My father was in his element recounting a major case he had argued that week. His voice filled the room with authority. My mother listened with admiration, tilting her head, just so as if she were still playing hostess even in her own dining room. Andrew, then 15, basked in their approval. He had just won a statewide speech contest, and my parents toasted him with pride. I waited for a moment, holding on to a piece of news I thought might matter. When there was finally a lull, I said softly, then louder, I got a perfect score on my essay. It was about hotels and how service can change someone's experience. The room went silent. My father paused, fork in hand, then smirked. His voice was sharp and dismissive. Hotels are for servants, Claire. Hamiltons don't wait on others. Hamiltons are waiting on. Andrew chuckled low at first, then louder. Maybe one day, Claire, you'll carry my tray of drinks while I'm signing million-dollar contracts. His laughter rang like a bell, cruel and clear. I turned to my mother, searching for something, anything. A glance of reassurance, a word to defend me. But she only placed her manicured hand on Andrew's shoulder. Her smile radiant. He's destined for greatness, she said, as though I wasn't even sitting there. My chest tightened. I forced myself to keep eating, though the food had turned to dust in my mouth. My hand trembled under the table, fingers curling into a fist against my thigh. That was the night I understood something vital in this family. I was invisible unless I failed. And even then, my failures would only serve as a backdrop to Andrew's brilliance. It was the first crack, the first fracture in what the world thought was a flawless family portrait. I learned quickly to keep my passions to myself. Whenever I mentioned hotels or service, my father's lips thinned in disdain. My mother would sigh and change the subject. Andrew, of course, would seize every chance to remind me how laughable my dreams were. Once, when I had spent hours carefully arranging brochures from different hotels in a scrapbook, Andrew snatched it from my hands, flipping through the pages before tossing it aside. You really think this is the future, he sneered. While I'm standing in courtrooms, you'll be fluffing pillows. I told myself I didn't care, but I did. I cared so much it burned inside me. The house itself seemed to echo my insignificance. Andrew's room was spacious, filled with books on law and politics trophies lining the shelves. My room was smaller, tucked away at the end of the hallway. I decorated it with souvenirs from hotels, tiny soaps, keycards, pens stamped with logos. Each item was a token of the life I imagined. My parents dismissed it as childish a phase I would outgrow. But in those walls, I nurtured a stubborn, quiet fire. What they didn't know was that every slight, every sneer, every look of dismissal was fuel. Each word of mockery carved deeper into me, but instead of breaking it hardened me. I promised myself silently, but fiercely, that one day the very dreams they laughed at would become the empire they could not ignore. Still, I was only 12. At that age, the weight of rejection pressed heavily. I remember sneaking into the bathroom after that dinner, closing the door, and turning on the faucet to mask my sobs. The mirror reflected a little girl with tear-stained cheeks whispering to herself one day they'll see. The memory lingers like a scar. Even now, years later, with boardrooms listening to my every decision and skyscrapers carrying my name, I can still hear Andrew's laughter at that table, sharp as glass. I can still feel the ache of being unseen in a house that looked perfect from the outside. That night became a turning point, though I didn't know it then. It planted the seed of my resolve. The Hamiltons valued law, prestige, and power, but I would build something different. I would build a world where people mattered, where dignity was not negotiable. And one day, I would make them witness it. People say the deepest wounds come from those closest to you. That evening, under the golden chandelier and the clink of crystal glasses, the first wound cut through me, and with it the first crack in my family's perfect facade began to show. I am Claire Hamilton, 32 now, chairwoman of Hamilton Hotels, the very empire my father once called a servant's trade. If you are watching this right now, tell me in the comments, have you ever been dismissed by your own family, made to feel small when you knew your dreams were bigger? Hit that like button and subscribe to follow this journey where betrayal, revenge, and justice unfold in ways my family never imagined. For years, I lived under the shadow of my brother, his achievements shining like polished trophies at every family gathering. My father's voice would boom with pride when Andrew's name appeared in a newspaper. My mother's eyes sparkled when he brought home another ribbon, another certificate, another reason for the neighbors to say the Hamilton family was destined for greatness. Meanwhile, I lived in the quiet corners of the house. I studied late into the night, not because anyone pushed me, but because I wanted to prove, at least to myself, that I was capable. I lined my bedroom walls with souvenirs from hotels, keycards, soap bars, matchboxes, each one a talisman of the life I dreamed of. When other girls my age wrote about prom or boyfriends in their journals, I filled pages with sketches of hotel lobbies. It was during high school that my love for hospitality grew into something fierce. While Andrew traveled for debate tournaments, I spent my weekends sneaking into Boston hotels pretending to be a guest. I would sit in the lobby for hours observing. I noticed how a single smile from the front desk could change the way a weary traveler carried themselves. I studied how managers moved with quiet authority, solving prob. At school, when teachers asked about our future plans, I spoke of hospitality with a shy certainty. Their eyebrows lifted sometimes with surprise, sometimes with pity. But Claire, with grades like yours, you could go into law. Or medicine, they'd say, as if choosing hotels meant wasting potential. I smiled politely, but inside I felt the sting. Even outside my home, the world seemed to echo my father's voice. Hamiltons were not meant for service. The only place I allowed myself to dream without restraint was in that small bedroom at the end of the hallway. I researched universities, circled deadlines on a calendar I hid inside my desk drawer, and whispered to myself late at night that one day I would get out. Cornell became my beacon. I read everything about their hotel school, its history, its alumni, the way it was spoken of with reverence in the industry. The brochures became my scripture, the application of my rebellion. When the acceptance letter finally arrived, I knew better than to expect celebration. I still remember the weight of the envelope in my hands, the crimson crest on the corner, the way my breath caught when I saw the word, "Congratulations." My heart soared, yet I also knew the silence that would follow. I tucked the letter under my pillow that night, as though keeping it close could shield it from the disdain I had grown used to. The next day I told them anyway. My father lowered his paper slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Hotels? That's for servants. You have the brains to be a lawyer." My mother sighed and shook her head. flipping another glossy magazine page. Andrew leaned back, his smirk widening. "Cornell wasted a spot," he said, laughter spilling out as if my dream were nothing more than a joke. Their dismissal cut deep, but something inside me hardened. I looked straight at my father and said words that shocked even me. "If you won't support me, I'll find a way. I'll work. I'll borrow. I'll go alone." That night I didn't cry because I was helpless. I cried because I was resolute. On my desk sat the calendar marked with application deadlines, a stack of notes from hotel visits, and the letter that proved someone somewhere believed I belonged. I pressed the envelope to my chest, whispering into the darkness, "This is mine. Even if I walk into that world with nothing but this letter, it will be enough." Looking back now, I know that was the night something broke free inside me. I stopped waiting for permission. I stopped begging for a place at their table. My path was set not by their pride, but by my defiance. That was the day the Hamilton family turned their backs on me. But it was also the day I found my own spine, the day I began walking toward the life that would one day make them bow their heads in silence. I left Brookline with nothing more than a worn-out suitcase and the little money I had managed to save. New York did not welcome me with the glow of Times Square lights or the glamour tourists dream of. Instead, it gave me a cramped room in Queens that I shared with 2 other students. The walls so thin I could hear every cough, every argument, every midnight phone call. Each morning I squeezed into the subway, pressed against strangers, clutching my Cornell textbooks while reciting notes under my breath. My other hand gripped a small notebook where I scribbled numbers, figuring out how many more shifts I needed to cover rent, how many tutoring sessions could pay for next month's books. The city was merciless, but I matched its pace one exhausted step after another. I worked 3 jobs at once. Nights found me behind the front desk of a modest hotel in Midtown, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as I greeted weary travelers with the best smile I could muster. Weekends I slipped into a stiff black apron at an Italian restaurant, carrying plates heavier than they looked, memorizing wine lists, dodging impatient customers. And in between, I tutored French for children of Manhattan's elite, smiling politely at parents who barely acknowledged me as they handed over envelopes of cash. My shoes wore down within months, the cheap soles splitting at the seams, but I walked on. My eyes carried shadows from endless nights, yet I refused to complain. For the first time in my life, I was living on my own terms. Each time I stood behind that hotel counter, watching staff coordinate, listening to the rhythm of phones ringing and doors closing, I felt a strange thrill. I filled pages with notes, how quickly housekeeping responded to requests, how the concierge handled difficult guests, how a single mistake could ripple through the system. Service, I realized, was not about forced smiles. It was about foresight. Grace under pressure, the ability to solve problems before they spiraled. One night the lesson became painfully clear. It was just past midnight when a guest stormed into the lobby. He was a VIP. His name bolded in the system, the kind of man staff whispered about before his arrival. Something had gone wrong with his reservation. His voice thundered through the lobby, his hand slamming the counter. The young clerk on duty, barely older than me, froze. I saw her eyes glisten, her lips trembling as she tried to apologize. The shouting grew louder. Other guests began to stare. I felt something twist in me. I couldn't let this unravel. I stepped forward, placing myself between the guest and the clerk. My voice was calm, steady, even though my palms were slick with sweat. I apologized sincerely, acknowledged his frustration, and within seconds I had upgraded his room, arranged complimentary breakfast, and offered him a car service voucher. His anger softened. His shoulders eased. By the time he took the key, his tone was almost cordial. When the doors closed behind him, the clerk burst into tears. I placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did fine," I said softly, though I knew she didn't believe it. I went home that night exhausted but strangely proud. For once I felt like I had taken control, like I had turned chaos into order. The next morning my first instinct was to call home to share the victory with someone who might understand. I dialed my father's number, foolishly expecting warmth. He listened in silence, then gave a short laugh, cold and sharp. "You're proud of serving people. You think handling their complaints is an achievement." When will you learn a real profession, Claire? When will you stop embarrassing yourself? The words hit me harder than I care to admit. I hung up quickly, staring at the silent phone, my chest tight. For a moment I thought I might break. But fate had other plans. Later that week, as I was logging out at the front desk, a woman approached me. She was impeccably dressed, her presence commanding without being harsh. She introduced herself as Catherine Brooks, a regional director for a luxury hotel chain. "I was in the lobby the other night," she said. Her eyes met mine with an intensity that made me straighten my posture. "I watched how you handled that guest. Calm, resourceful, not a trace of panic. That's rare. You have more in you than standing behind this desk." She slipped a business card into my hand. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I held the card for hours afterward, the embossed letters catching the light. For the first time in years, I felt seen. Not by my father, not by my mother, not by Andrew, by a stranger who recognized something I had almost forgotten about myself. That night, lying on the narrow bed in Queens, I stared at the cracked ceiling, Catherine's words echoing in my head. My exhaustion felt different. No longer a burden, but proof that I was moving forward. Proof that my life, as small and invisible as it seemed to my family, had value. My parents had turned their backs on me. My brother sneered at the path I chose. But New York, in its raw, unforgiving way, had handed me something precious, a door barely ajar waiting for me to push it open, and I swore to myself that I would, no matter the cost. After Cornell, life picked up speed faster than I could catch my breath. Catherine Brooks had pulled me into sterling hotels, and for 6 months I buried myself in learning everything I could. Then one winter morning, her voice cut through the phone, firm and commanding as always. "Claire, Chicago is sinking. That property is bleeding out. Investors are circling, staff are demoralized. I need someone fearless. Do you want it?" I didn't even pause. My suitcase was already half packed in my mind. When do I start? By the end of the week, I was standing outside Sterling, Chicago, the icy wind slicing through my coat. Chicago had a way of humbling you instantly, its gusts strong enough to make you doubt if you belong there. I pulled my scarf tighter, lifted my chin, and walked inside. What I found was worse than Catherine had hinted. The lobby was grand on the surface, marble floors and chandeliers, but empty cold like a theater after the audience had left. Guests complained at the desk, while clerks answered with robotic apologies. Waiters carried plates like they were dragging chains. Housekeepers moved as though every room was a punishment. On my second day, I stood in the break room introducing myself with a smile I forced through exhaustion. "I'm here to help us turn this place around." A housekeeper looked up from her sandwich, her eyes flat. "Turn it around, honey. We've been through 3 managers in 2 years. You'll be gone before spring." A waiter chimed in, smirking as he stacked dirty dishes. Another Cornell kid with fancy ideas. "Let's see how long before she runs back to New York." Their laughter wasn't loud, but it was enough to cut through me. I didn't argue. I only nodded and sat with them, eating the same bland staff meal, scribbling notes in my pad, while they stared in disbelief. For days I immersed myself in the underbelly of the hotel. I shadowed every department. I folded linens alongside housekeepers, wiped tables with waiters, listened to concierges complain about constant guest fury. At first my presence was met with silence or smirks, but slowly I began to understand where the rot was. It wasn't just poor service. It was hopelessness. Listening wasn't enough. Change had to happen. I redesigned the menu, swapping tired continental offerings for dishes Chicago actually craved. I begged ownership for a modest budget to launch a digital campaign targeting young professionals, especially the booming tech crowd. I set up training sessions, insisting that staff speak with warmth, not scripts. And on nights when cynicism smothered the air, I stayed until 3 a.m., setting tables myself, polishing glasses until they sparkled, proving I was not there to command from above, but to fight beside them. It was not met with applause. One afternoon, as I taped a new service chart on the wall, the old general manager leaned back in his chair, smirking at me. "So this is what Cornell teaches now, that a 20-something girl knows better than a team that's been here for decades," his voice carried, and a few employees chuckled behind their hands. My stomach nodded, but I didn't flinch. I simply kept writing, my marker squeaking across the board. Proving myself would not come from words, only results. The weeks dragged me thin. Occupancy reports screamed failure. My phone buzzed constantly with investors' numbers flashing across the screen. One evening I answered a call, my pen still in hand. A voice, clipped and impatient, fired at me. "Claire, the numbers are worse than last quarter. You promised us growth. If we don't see a turnaround, we're pulling out." I swallowed hard, gripping the desk until my knuckles whitened. "Give me time. I'm fixing the foundation. You'll see results." "Time is money," the man snapped, "and you're running out of both." The line went dead. I sat frozen, staring at the silent phone. For a moment, the weight of it all pressed against my chest so hard I thought I might crumble. But then I lifted my pen again. I kept writing. Then slowly something shifted. A group of young entrepreneurs booked a block of rooms drawn in by our campaign. They posted pictures of the new menu online, raving about it. Their reviews spread like sparks. By spring, occupancy inched upward. By summer, the bar buzzed with laughter, the lobby hummed with energy. Staff who once muttered behind my back began volunteering ideas, experimenting with service touches, rediscovering pride. 9 months after I arrived, Sterling Chicago was unrecognizable. Occupancy had climbed 40%. Revenues surged. Local press ran headlines calling it a resurrection. I stood in the back of the ballroom during one of our events as photographers captured guests, laughing waiters moving seamlessly, music filling the air. My chest ached with a pride that felt bone deep. Catherine arrived for a quarterly review. She walked through the lobby slowly, eyes sharp, taking in every detail. When she turned to me, her lips curved into a rare smile. "I took a gamble on you," she said. And I was right. That night I stepped out onto my balcony. The Chicago wind rattled against the railing, sharp and unforgiving, but I barely felt it. I had proven not just that I could survive. I had proven that I could lead. I picked up my phone, heart thudding with a familiar longing. Perhaps foolishly, I dialed home. "Dad?" I said, trying to steady my voice. "Sterling Chicago is back. We're the #1 hotel in the city." Silence stretched before his cold laugh cut through. "A hotel, Claire? You expect me to be impressed because you've learned how to serve rich people? When will you stop embarrassing yourself and find a real profession?" The words landed like ice, but this time I did not break. I ended the call quietly, staring at my reflection in the glass door. The city lights stretched endlessly below, alive and brilliant. Inside, something hardened into certainty. That night I understood what set me apart from my family. They measured worth in court victories and contracts. I measured it in people, in service, in resilience. The night Sterling Chicago came back to life, I did not just save a hotel. I became the leader my family never believed I could be. Chicago had proven I could breathe life into a dying property, but deep inside I knew I wasn't meant to spend my life saving someone else's legacy. I wanted to build my own. I wanted the Hamilton name, the same name my parents had used to dismiss me, to mean something entirely different. In 2015, I sat in my cramped Manhattan apartment, the glow of the city outside flickering across my walls. My desk was littered with coffee cups, notebooks, and endless drafts of a business plan I had rewritten more times than I could count. Each page was smudged with ink and exhaustion, but it carried the weight of my determination. Investors were not easy to convince. Most looked at me, a young woman with limited resources and a family name unconnected to hospitality, and politely declined. But eventually a small group of investors took a chance not on my background, but on the fire in my pitch. They gave me just enough to take the most reckless leap of my life. I purchased a crumbling hotel in Providence, Rhode Island. When I first walked through its revolving door, the smell of mildew and damp carpets hit me so hard I nearly gagged. The wallpaper peeled in long curling strips. The elevators creaked and jolted like coffins on cables. Guest rooms carried the stale odor of neglect. Friends called it a coffin for money, a sinking ship, a disaster waiting to happen. But when I stood in the grand lobby and tilted my head upward, I saw a high vaulted ceiling with intricate woodwork waiting to be uncovered. The bones of the building whispered history. Its location right in the heart of Providence pulsed with potential. Where others saw decay, I saw a diamond buried in dust. What followed were the most grueling 18 months of my life. I slept no more than 4 hours a night. Mornings began with me rushing to construction sites, hard hat slipping over my tangled hair, barking questions at contractors who doubted me from the start. By afternoon, I was at banks pleading for refinancing, showing spreadsheets that barely held together. Evenings were consumed with selecting fabrics, testing linens between my fingers, rejecting samples that didn't feel right. By midnight, I collapsed over blueprints and vendor contracts only to wake at 3 a.m., drenched in sweat, heart pounding with the thought that I might lose everything. There were nights I cried quietly on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by invoices I couldn't pay. My friends from Cornell posted photos of rooftop parties and romantic getaways, while my reality was cold takeout and unpaid bills. I missed birthdays, reunions, and weddings. My world was plaster dust and endless deadlines, and yet I refused to give up. One winter morning, the lobby stood stripped bare scaffolding, rising into the air like skeletons. My contractor shook his head, muttering, "This place is cursed. You'll never pull it off." I clenched my fists until my nails bit into my palms and answered with the only thing I had left. "Watch me." Month by month, the curse broke. The old woodwork was restored, polished until it gleamed with warmth. The chandeliers, once dull with grime, now cascaded light across marble floors. Guest rooms were transformed with crisp linens, elegant furniture, and a faint scent of lavender I personally chose. Every detail carried my touch. The opening night arrived like a miracle. I wore a simple black dress, my hair pulled into a bun, my hands trembling as I adjusted my necklace. When the doors opened, the lobby filled with laughter and clicking heels. Photographers snapped pictures. Reporters scribbled notes as they tasted hors d'oeuvres. The chandeliers sparkled as if they knew they were being reborn. The next morning, headlines splashed across travel magazines: Hamilton Hotel, Providence's stunning rebirth. The name Hamilton finally stood for something more than rejection. Within 3 months, we turned a profit far ahead of every forecast. My face appeared on the cover of a glossy travel magazine, smiling confidently, framed by the grand staircase I had fought to restore. For a fleeting moment, I thought this was the recognition I had longed for. I picked up the phone, dialing home with a hopeful flutter in my chest. "Dad." "Mom," I said, my voice brimming with restrained pride. "We did it. Hamilton Hotel is open, and it's a success." I waited for joy, or at least acknowledgement. Instead, my mother's distracted voice floated back, muffled with background noise. "That's nice, Claire, but we can't talk for long. We're at Andrew's celebration. He just made a partner. It's a huge night." In the background, I heard glasses clinking, voices cheering my father's laughter. Their world was filled with Andrew's triumph while mine was met with silence. I forced a congratulations for my brother, hung up, and sat frozen at my desk. The magazine with my face on the cover lay in front of me, the bold letters Hamilton glowing under the lamp. For the world, I had accomplished something extraordinary. For my parents, it was nothing compared to Andrew's golden path. My voice inside turned cold and steady. That night I realized something bitterly clear. No matter what I built, no matter how high I climbed, I would always be invisible in their eyes. My success would never be enough to eclipse Andrew's shadow. But this time, instead of breaking me, it sharpened me. If they could not celebrate me now, they would one day be forced to. They would walk into rooms with my name carved on the walls, stay in suites bearing my brand, and realize too late that the daughter they dismissed had built an empire. That night I didn't cry. I stared out of my window at the lights of Manhattan and whispered to myself that the Hamilton legacy would be rewritten, and this time it would be mine. By 2021, I was 30 years old, and Hamilton Hotels had grown into a name that no one in the hospitality industry could ignore. From the East Coast to the West Coast, 10 properties stood proudly under my banner. And then the deal I had only dreamed about became reality. I acquired Sterling Hotels, a chain that had once defined American luxury but had long since fallen into decline. The press called it the hospitality coup of the decade. That morning in Manhattan, I wore a white suit tailored to perfection. The conference hall was blinding with camera flashes, reporters shouting questions, microphones pushed forward as though every word I spoke might rewrite the industry. I smiled. I answered with confidence, and for once, I allowed myself to believe the headlines. The woman who had been dismissed as a future maid was now being hailed as the one who had changed the face of American hospitality. With Sterling under my wing, Hamilton Hotels became a global brand stretching across 16 properties in the United States and Europe. Catherine, the woman who had once handed me a business card in a dingy New York lobby, now stood beside me as my chief operating officer. Together, we had an empire. For the first time in my life, I felt unstoppable. And yet, under the weight of all that recognition, my heart still carried one craving I could not silence. I wanted my family to see me. I wanted my father to look at me with pride, my mother to speak my name without hesitation, my brother to acknowledge that I had built something greater than his carefully paved path. Thanksgiving gave me that chance. I returned to Brookline, driving past the familiar streets where the maples arched their branches over winding roads. The Hamilton House stood the same, a colonial monument of brick and symmetry, its windows glowing with warm light. I had not been back for years yet. The sight stirred something inside me, a mixture of nostalgia and old wounds. The front door opened to the same polished floors, the same faint smell of my mother's perfume lingering in the air. My parents greeted me with polite nods, nothing more. Andrew swept in next, pulling me into a hug that was more performance than affection. He thumped my back as if he were the magnanimous host and I the guest of honor. Dinner unfolded beneath the glow of candles and the shimmer of crystal. My father spoke of a high-profile lawsuit he was handling, his voice booming with pride. My mother detailed the guest list for an upcoming gala, her eyes sparkling with the anticipation of compliments she would receive. Andrew leaned forward, animated, sharing that he was about to represent a major corporate client. His face flushed with the thrill of his own importance. When I mentioned the Sterling acquisition, the room paused only for a breath. My father glanced at me, his lips curving into something between a smile and a smirk. Hotels, Claire, are still just places where people sleep. Nothing more. The words cut sharper than he knew. Andrew chuckled, swirling the wine in his glass. Real power isn't in lobbies or turn-down services. It's in boardrooms and contracts. That's where respect is earned. My mother adjusted the silverware as though his remark required no correction. I sat there, the flicker of candlelight dancing across their indifferent faces, feeling the weight of years crash down on me again. My hand trembled against the stem of my wine glass, and I pressed it harder against the table to steady it. For a moment, I wanted to shout, to list every statistic, every headline, every accolade. I wanted to remind them that my brand now employed thousands, that celebrities and politicians chose my hotels, that the world outside our dining room already knew my worth. But all I said was quiet, steady. One day I told Andrew, my voice threading through the room like smoke, "You will swallow every word you've spoken tonight." His smirk deepened, almost gleeful at my defiance. He lifted his glass toward me, his tone dripping with condescension. "I'll be waiting, little sister." The clink of crystal against crystal echoed through the room like a challenge, sealing our roles more clearly than ever. I looked from my brother to my parents, searching one last time for something I had always longed for. It wasn't there. All I saw was dismissal, a certainty that their son was the star, their daughter the afterthought. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. Instead, I sat taller in my chair, shoulders square, face composed. Inside, the fury burned clean and bright, no longer a wound but a weapon. That night, I realized something unshakable. When strangers doubted me, I could fight harder. But when my own blood belittled me at the very height of my success, they were not only dismissing me, they were digging the ground for their own downfall. The voice in my head was no longer pleading. It was promising. They had chosen disdain over recognition. And disdain, I knew, has a way of becoming the sharpest kind of regret. After the Sterling deal, My life was a carousel of board meetings, shareholder calls, and expansion plans that stretched across Europe. My days blurred into contracts and conferences, my nights into strategy sessions with Catherine. Everything seemed to move in a rhythm of triumph. Until one morning, a thick folder landed on my desk. It was a report from our legal department. The first page carried a name that made my stomach drop. A law firm in Boston had signed advisory contracts using the name Hamilton Hotels, and the partner behind it was none other than Andrew Hamilton. For a long moment, I sat in silence, the hum of Manhattan traffic faint outside my window. My brother hadn't just dismissed my work anymore. He was dragging my company's name into his games, as if my success was nothing more than a brand he could borrow, twist, and claim. I booked the first train to Boston. The glass tower that housed his firm gleamed in the winter sun, cold and perfect, like everything Andrew touched. Inside, the marble lobby echoed with clipped footsteps and hushed voices. I walked past the receptionist, my heels striking against the polished floor, with sharp certainty even as my pulse quickened. Andrew's office was exactly as I expected, sleek, curated, filled with the smell of leather and old books. He rose from behind his mahogany desk in a navy suit that fit him like armor, his Rolex catching the light. His smile was sharp, too polished, too rehearsed. "Well," he said, extending his hand like he was welcoming a client. "Did you come to congratulate me on landing such a prestigious account?" I didn't take his hand. I placed the folder on his desk, sliding it toward him. "You're using my company's name to sign contracts. That's a trademark violation." He leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers across his chest, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Clients don't care who owns what, Claire. They see Hamilton and they trust it. I'm simply delivering what they already believe in." The arrogance in his tone scraped against every raw nerve I had. He was not only undermining me, he was trying to turn the very name I had rebuilt into a mockery. "You're trespassing on my work," I said, my voice low but steady. "If you don't stop, I will file suit." Andrew chuckled, a deep, dismissive sound that filled the room. "Go ahead. Do you really think the legal community in Boston will side with a hotelier against one of their own?" "You're not in my arena, Claire. You never were." I stared at him, and for the first time I saw it clearly. This wasn't about clients or contracts. This was about power. He needed me beneath him, even if it meant poisoning our family's name. I gathered the folder, stood, and met his eyes. "You may think the law is your shield, but you forget something. Justice doesn't bend to arrogance forever." His smirk widened, but I didn't wait for a reply. I walked out, each step echoing in the sterile hallway, my heart pounding not with fear, but with fury. Outside, the Boston air was brutal, snowflakes whipping against my face. The city was cloaked in white, but inside me a different fire was spreading, hot and merciless. I pulled my coat tighter, dug my phone from my pocket, and dialed Catherine. "Gather everything we have," I said as soon as she answered. My voice didn't shake. "Every document, every contract with my company's name attached. Andrew's playing games with the law. We'll give him the one thing he doesn't expect: exposure." Catherine's voice was crisp, sharp with loyalty. "Understood. If he wants to hide behind the law, we'll turn it into his cage." I ended the call and stood for a moment in the falling snow, my breath clouding in the air. All my life, Andrew had mocked, belittled, dismissed. At the dinner table, he used his words like knives. In my adulthood, he used his connections, his image, his status. Now he wanted to wield the law itself as if it were a weapon only he could hold. But he had underestimated me. The law was not his alone. And the law, like people, could be compelled to see the truth. As I walked back toward the station, snow crunching under my heels, I let the thought settle like steel inside me. Andrew believed he could use our family name to crush me, but he had forgotten the most important truth. I had forged that name into something powerful, something undeniable, and I would not let him turn it into ash. That night, as the train carried me back to Manhattan, I stared at the reflection in the window. My face was calm, but my eyes burned with resolve. Andrew thought the law would shield him, but he had no idea what it meant to face a woman who had built her own justice brick by brick, scar by scar. In March of 2023, my phone lit up with a message from my mother. No greeting, no warmth, just a line of cold instruction. Claire, the family is hosting an important dinner at Hamilton, Boston. You should be there. The words were clipped, stripped of affection, and I knew at once what they meant. This was not an invitation. It was a command. I also knew it wasn't about me. It never was. This was Andrew's stage, carefully set, so my parents could parade their golden son before Boston's finest lawyers and my father's powerful associates. I stared at the message for a long moment, the glow of the screen reflecting in my coffee cup. I could have ignored it. I had every reason to. But a quiet pull inside me, that mix of pride and fury that had guided me my whole life, urged me to go. If they wanted me as a spectator, I would sit in the audience, and I would wait. The night of the dinner, I stepped out of my car in front of Hamilton, Boston, my hotel. My name is carved in gold above the entrance. Inside the lobby, glittered with chandeliers, the marble floors polished so bright they mirrored every heel that struck them. Guests in gowns and tailored suits glided past, laughter echoing beneath the crystal lights. The dining room was a spectacle. Long tables draped in silk crystal goblets catching the light, and white roses arranged with painstaking precision. My mother floated between tables in a flowing emerald gown, pointing at flower vases, adjusting the bows on chairbacks, her voice a sharp whisper to the staff. This is Andrew's night. Nothing must go wrong. Near the center of the room, my father stood like a general, his arm draped over Andrew's shoulder as though presenting his heir to the kingdom. Andrew wore a navy suit perfectly tailored, his smile wide, and polished his hand, gesturing as he boasted about the contract he was about to close with a multinational firm. His laugh rang out, practiced and commanding, while people leaned in, eager to bask in his glow. I walked in unnoticed, my heels tapping against the floor, as though the walls themselves knew whose hotel this was. But to my family, I was invisible. My mother caught sight of me, her lips tightening into a polite curve, then turned back to the guests. My father gave me a curt nod, his attention already consumed by Andrew's performance. Emily slipped through the crowd toward me, her small hand reaching for mine. She was the only one whose eyes carried kindness. Her voice was low, almost apologetic. Don't let it get to you, Claire. They're never going to change. I gave her a faint smile, though inside me something darker stirred, restless and sharp. When the seating was announced, I discovered my place card at the far end of the table beside the server's station, the seat reserved for afterthoughts. Meanwhile, Andrew sat at the center beneath the chandelier, the spotlight cascading over him as though the evening were his coronation. I sat quietly, my spine straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap. The air hummed with conversation as guests trickled in, laughter swelling like waves in the grand hall. Glasses clinked, silverware gleamed, and every detail spoke of celebration. Except for me. Then, as the last guest settled, my mother raised her glass and her voice. My son Andrew, she said, her tone rich with pride, is the pride of the Hamilton family. He embodies true intellect and class, and tonight we honor the great work he continues to do. She paused, her gaze sliding deliberately to me, her lips curling ever so slightly. As for Claire, well, she keeps herself busy in the service industry, which is fine. At least she has something to occupy her time. A ripple of soft laughter traveled around the table, subtle but cutting. Andrew's smile spread wider, smug, as though the jab were his victory. I felt the sting sharp and deep, but my face betrayed nothing. I sat still, my hand resting on my thigh, the fabric of my dress pressed tight beneath my clenched fingers. My heart thundered in my chest, yet my expression remained calm, serene even. I lifted my glass, the candlelight dancing across its surface, and for a fleeting moment I caught Andrew watching me. His eyes held that familiar arrogance, the same look he had worn since childhood. He believed this room, this night, this family belonged to him alone. But he didn't know. None of them did. As the conversation swirled and the candles flickered, my voice echoed inside me, steady and cold. They thought they could humiliate me in my own domain. They thought I would sit quietly while Andrew basked in false glory. They were wrong. Because the very walls around us, the waiters moving with precision, the chandeliers blazing above the engraved Hamilton name at the entrance, all of it was mine. I set my glass down gently, my eyes sweeping the table, my breath slow and deliberate. Let them laugh now. Let them dismiss me. They had no idea what was about to unfold. The evening had only begun, but I knew one truth with certainty. This night would not end the way they planned. Soft music drifted through the grand banquet hall of Hamilton Boston violins, weaving around the hum of conversation. Guests raised their glasses in polite toasts, laughter mingling with the sparkle of crystal. Above us, the chandeliers burned with a brilliance that made the whole room glow like a royal ball. I sat at the far end of the long table, a posture composed, a faint smile fixed to my lips. At the center, Andrew shone as if every light had been set for him. The waiters moved in synchronized rhythm, placing down plates of the main course. The scent of roasted lamb and buttered vegetables filled the air, a performance of elegance as carefully staged as the evening itself. Andrew picked up his glass, cleared his throat, and rose slightly from his chair. His eyes found me at the far end, and his smile curved in that old cutting way I had known since childhood. Tonight he began, his voice carrying easily over the table. I want to raise a toast to the Hamilton family for having a true heir worthy of its legacy. Scattered applause fluttered across the room, hesitant but obedient. He held up a hand as though accepting their praise, then leaned back and let the words that followed strike their target. And we should be grateful, of course, he said smoothly, that I am here to carry the family's honor. Because with what little money my sister has, she couldn't even afford a night in this very hotel. The laughter came fast, erupting like a wave breaking against stone. Some guests covered their mouths, pretending courtesy while their shoulders shook. Others let their laughter ring free, turning toward me with the glint of amusement in their eyes. My mother rested her manicured hand proudly on Andrew's arm, her smile radiant. My father nodded his glass, raised his voice booming. That's right, son. There is only one true success here. My heart squeezed tight, each laugh echoing inside me like the slam of a door. I glanced at Emily seated nearby. Her face was pale, her eyes searching mine with quiet pity. She didn't laugh. She never did. The sound swelled again, and for a moment I felt 12 years old at that oak dinner table, my essay in hand, my father's dismissive smirk burning into me. The same pain, the same dismissal. Yet this time I was no child, and this was no school essay. I lifted my glass, the ruby red wine trembling faintly against the rim. My smile did not fade. Andrew leaned slightly forward, lowering his voice just enough that everyone still heard. His words dripped with satisfaction. Perhaps next time Claire should bring a tray of water and napkins. That way she'll fit in here better. The room broke again into cruel laughter, harsher this time, fueled by the comfort of mockery. Andrew's grin widened his shoulders, relaxed, his victory claimed. I set my glass down carefully, the stem clicking softly against the linen-draped table. My hand trembled beneath the cloth, but my face stayed composed. I looked at Andrew, then at my parents, then at the sea of faces lit by chandeliers and smugness. And I smiled. Not the brittle smile of tolerance, but something steadier, sharper. A smile that carried no fear. Andrew's eyes flickered. Just for a second, confusion passed across his face. He had expected me to shrink, to hide, to let his words press me down as they always had. But I didn't. The laughter around me began to fade, not because it stopped, but because I no longer let it pierce me. Each chuckle became distant, hollow. Inside the fire I had carried for decades roared higher. They thought silence meant defeat. They mistook stillness for surrender. But my silence was nothing of the sort. I sat there serene amid their mockery, my pulse steadying, my mind clearing. Every word Andrew had thrown at me, every cheer my parents had offered him, every smirk cast down the table, I let it settle into memory, into fuel. They believed I was humiliated. They believed I had no answer. But they had no idea that their stage, their laughter, their supposed triumph was setting the scene for something far greater than any of them could imagine. I folded my napkin in my lap, smoothed its edge with deliberate calm, and lifted my eyes once more to the glittering room. Let them laugh tonight. Tomorrow they would remember this dinner not for Andrew's triumph, but for the silence that preceded the storm. The air in the banquet hall pressed against my skin like the edge of a blade. Laughter still echoed faintly, Andrew leaning back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had already won. My mother's eyes shone with pride as she gazed at him, and my father lifted his glass as if Andrew's triumph were his own reflection. I sat quietly at the far end of the table, a faint smile tugging at my lips, waiting. The clinking of silverware softened as Andrew rose again, wineglass in hand. His chest swelled, his voice already preparing to crown himself once more. But before he could speak, a figure moved into the circle of candlelight. A waiter stepped forward, bowing slightly before me. His voice was steady, formal, resonant enough to carry across the table. "Good evening, Chairwoman Hamilton. The presidential suite has been prepared for you. We are ready whenever you wish to receive your key." The words dropped into the air like thunder. The hall fell silent. The glass in Andrew's hand slipped, shattering against the marble floor in a burst of red wine and crystal shards. The sound rang out sharp and final like the breaking of an illusion. For a breathless moment, no one moved. Conversations froze mid-sentence, forks poised in the air, eyes darting from the waiter to me. I lifted my gaze slowly, meeting the sea of shocked faces. The chandeliers still blazed overhead, but their light no longer crowned Andrew. It found me. My father was the first to speak, his voice cracking under the weight of disbelief. "What did you just say?" My mother stammered, her hand clutching her pearls. "Claire, Chairwoman, that can't be right. Can't." Andrew's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing, desperate to find footing. "It's a mistake. She just manages small things, that's all. She doesn't—" His words faltered, crumbling like the glass at his feet. I rose from my chair with deliberate calm. My black dress shimmered faintly beneath the candlelight, the fabric flowing like water, as I straightened to my full height. I let my eyes lock onto Andrew's, and when I spoke, my voice cut through the stillness with precision. "No, Andrew, this isn't a mistake. I can more than afford a dinner here. I own this hotel. Not just this one, but every Hamilton hotel from Boston to New York, from Chicago to London. The presidential suite you scoff at, it is mine." Gasps swept through the table. Guests exchanged hurried whispers, disbelief etched across their faces. One man leaned toward his wife, murmuring, "She's the chairwoman of the whole chain." Another shook his head, staring at me as if he had never truly seen me before. I took a step closer to the center, every movement slow, controlled. "You laughed at me for being in hospitality," I continued, my eyes never leaving Andrew. "You said I was unworthy, that I would never matter. But tonight in this room, under this roof, it is not you who holds power. It is me." My father's lips parted, but no words came. My mother's gaze dropped to the tablecloth, her hands trembling against her glass. Emily, seated quietly near the edge, pressed her fingers to her lips, her eyes wide, not with pity this time, but with awe. Andrew's jaw tightened, his fists curling at his sides. This doesn't change anything," he muttered, his voice brittle. "Hotels are still just service. You're not enough." My voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of every slight, every wound, every dismissal I had endured. "You do not define me. You never did. For years you mocked me and they applauded you. But now everyone in this room sees the truth. The Hamilton name does not rest on your shoulders. It rests on mine." The silence that followed was heavier than any laughter that had filled the hall before. I returned to my seat, placing my wineglass on the table with care. Its soft tap against the linen was the only sound for several seconds. Around me, the air shifted. Guests who had laughed moments earlier now glanced at Andrew with unease, their smiles fading into discomfort. The weight of his arrogance had collapsed, leaving only the fragments of his pride scattered on the marble floor with the broken glass. I lifted my glass once more, my lips curving into a calm smile. The crimson wine glowed under the light as I held it steady, unshaken. Inside me, a voice whispered with clarity, They thought my silence was a weakness. They thought my stillness was surrender. But silence can hold power and stillness can carry the promise of storm. The storm had broken now. The room no longer belonged to Andrew. It belonged to me. The weight of silence pressed down on the hall like a heavy curtain. Moments earlier, the air had been thick with laughter and derision. Now the only sounds were the faint clink of glasses settling onto the table and the restless shifting of guests in their chairs. I sat still, my back straight, the faintest trace of composure carved across my face. Across from me, Andrew slumped, his white shirt stained with wine, his hands trembling as if he no longer recognized the body he inhabited. He stood suddenly, his voice cracking in desperation. All right. This is just a misunderstanding. Everyone don't listen to her. Claire, she loves to exaggerate. She's only been given temporary privileges. Isn't that right? His eyes darted toward me, searching for the smallest nod, a lifeline to preserve the fragments of his dignity. My father's voice cut in before I could answer, sharp and commanding, though his words shook faintly. Claire, enough of this spectacle. You are Andrew's sister. He is the heir of this family, and family matters should never be aired before guests. Sit down and stop humiliating us. My mother leaned closer, her hand clutching her glass, her tone almost pleading. Please don't strip him bare like this in front of everyone. Let your brother keep his pride. People will talk. Their words washed over me like bitter wind. I looked at their faces, so familiar yet so foreign now, and saw nothing of remorse, nothing of reflection. Only fear. Not fear of losing me, not fear of the years they had cast me aside, but fear of their names slipping from the pedestal they had clung to for decades. Andrew tried again, his voice higher, strained. He forced a smile at the guests, his teeth clenched tight. Of course, Claire owns a few shares. She helps where she can. But Hamilton Hotels is still the pride of the Hamilton family. Isn't that right, Claire? A laugh escaped me sharp, and cutting a sound I had never allowed myself at their expense until this very moment. The smile slid from Andrew's face as color drained from his cheeks. Shares? I said, my tone calm yet piercing. Andrew, you don't hold a single share. Not one. Every hotel, every contract, every key handed to every guest belongs to me. You, who mocked me for years, own nothing. The empire you tried to claim tonight exists only in your imagination. The reaction was swift. Heads turned toward him, whispers rose in hushed but unmistakable waves. A woman at the far end murmured to her companion, her voice carrying just enough to be heard. So he really has nothing. A man chuckled, not bothering to conceal his disdain. Andrew's face flushed deep crimson, his hand reaching for another glass of wine, but his grip faltered. The liquid spilled over the tablecloth, bleeding into the fabric like a wound. My father's jaw clenched, his knuckles pale as he gripped the edge of the table. My mother's eyes darted helplessly, seeking rescue in the faces of the guests, but finding none. Emily sat frozen, her eyes locked on me, tears glistening in the corners, but her lips curving into the faintest smile. I slipped my phone from my clutch, the gesture quiet, deliberate. My fingers typed only a few words, and then I pressed send. Revoke all Hamilton family VIP privileges. Effective immediately. The message left my screen and entered the veins of the system I had built, swift and merciless. Minutes later, a hotel manager appeared at the doorway. He approached with professional calm, his steps measured as he came to stand at the head of the table. His voice was clear, neutral, unshaken by the tension that strangled the room. Ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you that effective immediately, the VIP privileges of the Hamilton family are no longer valid. All services will now be provided at the standard guest level. The words struck like a gavel. Andrew's mouth fell open, his body rigid as if the floor beneath him had collapsed. My father's hand slammed against the table, the sharp sound startling the guests, but he had no words to follow it. My mother covered her mouth with trembling fingers, her eyes wide with disbelief, horror mingled with humiliation. The guests exchanged glances, some suppressing smiles, others struggling to conceal their shock. No one rose to defend my family. No one offered sympathy. The same people who had once bowed to their presence now looked at them as fallen royalty stripped bare of the illusion they had so carefully curated. I raised my glass, not to toast, not to gloat, but simply to anchor myself in the moment. The crimson wine swirled within the crystal, its reflection shimmering like blood under the chandelier. Inside, my voice whispered calm and resolute. They thought themselves untouchable. They believed their name was shield enough against the truth. But tonight in this very hall, the truth has been spoken aloud, and truth is the harshest sentence of all. The verdict had been delivered, and they were guilty. The announcement lingered in the air long after the manager left. The clinking of glasses ceased, the lively chatter evaporated, and a suffocating stillness filled the room. I watched Andrew lower his head, his shoulders shaking faintly. His once polished image collapsed in front of every person whose approval he had fought so hard to keep. My father's face turned scarlet with rage, his fists clenched tight against the linen tablecloth. My mother's hand trembled as she pressed a napkin to her lips, unable to form words. Some guests exchanged uneasy glances. Others rose quietly, muttering excuses as they left, unwilling to remain in the ashes of a fallen dynasty. The power that had once surrounded the Hamilton name disintegrated in real time like smoke dissolving into the cold Boston night. I pushed back my chair and rose slowly, adjusting the hem of my black dress with deliberate calm. Every eye turned to me. Not in mockery, not in dismissal, but in something closer to reverence. My gaze traveled across the table, landing on the three faces that had shaped my childhood with contempt. My voice was steady, the quiet force of years compressed into words. For as long as I can remember, you told me I wasn't enough. You said I wasn't smart enough, not wealthy enough, not worthy enough to carry this name. You laughed when I spoke of dreams, you pushed me aside at every table, and you fed me silence when I begged for recognition. But tonight, right here in the place you once exiled me from, I stand not as your shadow. I stand as the chairwoman of Hamilton Hotels. A fork clattered against a plate, the sound sharp in the silence. My father opened his mouth, ready to unleash his usual authority, but his voice never came. One of the senior partners from his law firm, seated a few chairs down, leaned forward and spoke instead. His tone was low, yet every word cut with precision. Richard, the truth is plain. Your daughter has surpassed all of us. She built what none of us could. You may cling to your pride, but you cannot deny her triumph. The words landed like a final gavel. My father sank back in his chair, his jaw tight, his authority dissolved. My mother dabbed at her eyes, though whether from humiliation or grief I could not tell. Andrew hunched forward, elbows on the table, his hands shielding his face. The same brother who once stood taller, louder, brighter than me in every room now sat diminished, stripped of illusion. He did not argue any more. He could not. Emily rose quietly from her seat and crossed the room. Her small hand slipped into mine, her grip firm, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. In her gaze, I saw something I had longed for all my life from this family pride. Not in Andrew, not in the Hamilton name, but in me. I turned back to the guests, their eyes waiting. My voice softened, but carried to every corner of the room. Justice does not always arrive in courtrooms. Sometimes it walks quietly into dinner halls. Tonight was not about humiliation. It was about truth. And the truth is simple. Those who mock, belittle, and dismiss others will one day find themselves kneeling to the very people they tried to destroy. A ripple moved through the crowd. Some nodded, others whispered, but no laughter rose again. I had said what needed to be said, and it was enough. I released Emily's hand and walked toward the exit, each step deliberate, my heels echoing against the marble floor. I felt dozens of eyes trail me not with pity, but with awe. For years I had left rooms as the overlooked daughter, the forgotten sibling. Tonight I left as the woman who had rewritten the story. Outside, the Boston air was sharp against my skin, carrying the chill of early spring. I lifted my face to the night sky, its vastness clear above the city lights, and let out a breath I had been holding for decades, the weight I had carried since childhood, The burden of rejection, the ache of invisibility lifted at last. As I stood beneath the quiet glow of the hotel entrance, my thoughts turned inward, sifting through years of wounds and scars. Revenge had been the fuel that pushed me through sleepless nights, endless battles, and the loneliness of building an empire without a family to cheer me on. But now, in this moment of victory, I realized the sweetest part was not watching them fall. It was knowing I had never truly needed their approval to rise. For so long I thought my story would only be complete when they finally bowed their heads to me. Yet standing there, hearing the muffled chaos still unraveling inside, I understood something deeper. My worth had never depended on their recognition. It had been written into every risk I took, every door I refused to let slam shut, every tear I wiped away in silence. Emily joined me at the door, her arms slipping around my shoulder. She leaned close and whispered, "You did it, Claire. You showed them." I smiled at her, a warmth flooding me that no victory alone could bring. "No, Emily," I said softly. "I didn't just show them. I showed myself." We walked together down the steps, the city stretching wide before us. Somewhere behind us, Andrew still sat among shattered glass, my parents grappling with the ruins of their pride. But I no longer carried their weight. The night belonged to me. My story was no longer about being the forgotten daughter. It was about being the woman who refused to forget herself. I paused at the curb, watching the headlights sweep past, and spoke the truth I wanted etched into the hearts of anyone who had ever felt unseen. Life will not always hand you fairness. Sometimes it will hand you ridicule, rejection, and cruelty from those you trusted most. But remember this: you are not defined by their blindness. You are defined by your resilience, your choices, and your courage to stand tall, even when no one believes you can. And one day, when you least expect it, the tables will turn. And when they do, you will not only survive, you will shine. The city breathed around me, and for the first time in years, I felt free. If this story touched you, share your thoughts with me. Have you ever been dismissed, underestimated, or mocked by those closest to you? I would love to hear your experiences. And if you want to walk with me through more journeys of justice, revenge, and the power of resilience, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Together we will continue telling the stories that prove the truth, always find